Before 5,500 years ago, as far as we yet know, no city ever existed. Humans had gradually spread across the globe and accrued, at a glacial pace relative to what was to come, ever more knowledge. From a world where the most dense and interconnected places were villages and even some towns, full-fledged cities and states emerged. And shortly thereafter, full-scale agrarian civilizations made an appearance and across time came to dominate the human story. The lines between a city and a town are not entirely clear, but the basic idea is that a city has more people than a town, with 10,000 being the lower limit for a city in the mind of some, and a city also has more specialization of professions, as the increasingly bountiful food production allows for more and more people to be doing something other than farming plants and or animals. Another feature of cities, which goes right along with the growing surplus of resources, is the increasing differentiation between the fabulously wealthy, the very wealthy, and everyone else. These divisions were far slighter the farther back into history you go, but as certain towns and then cities arose, the dwellings of the haves and have-nots got increasingly dissimilar in size, and what they were buried with often differed greatly as well. And more than that, some people are now in charge of great amounts of resources. Resources such as humans, domesticated animals, domesticated plants, and the ever-growing world of other products, like farming tools, obsidian blades, pottery, and textiles. Those in power can use these resources to build temples for the gods, irrigation systems for the people, and palaces for themselves. But cities can't survive without farmers from whom they get their food, and the unified network of city or a couple of cities along with the neighboring land they got their sustenance from is what a state is. The authority of that system is a government, and once the amount of cities under united rule reaches greater expanse in numbers, we have an agrarian civilization on our globe. When states arise, they leave behind markers of the power to control and put to use great amounts of resources, such as the buildings of temples, palaces, and irrigation systems. And the writing that tends to arise with these early civilizations is yet another marker of the rise of this new under-the-sun phenomena, states and agrarian civilizations. The first city known to have come into existence is Uruk of southern Mesopotamia, 3500 BC. Within the next couple of hundred years, however, several other cities joined the mix, such as Nippur, Ur, and Lagash. At its advent of city status 5,500 years ago, Uruk is estimated to have housed 10,000 people. Within the next 300 years, 2 temples were built, the White Temple, which came to be associated with the sky god, An, and the Inanna complex, associated with Inanna. But despite these buildings, which appear to be religious, there are no palaces until a couple of hundred years after 3000 BC. This fact, along with the lack of any other evidence of kings, may suggest that initially priests were in power. Uruk had reached as many as 100,000 inhabitants by 2500 BC, and by then writing had developed. Here's the gist of that story. By as early as 7500 BC, clay seals with pictures on them were being used, and marble-sized clay tokens of different shapes were being used to represent objects. The tokens came to be designed on their surfaces across time, and the signs on the tokens and on the clay seals represented specific objects. Eventually, they started enclosing the tokens in clay envelopes, and they embossed the envelope with an image of the token. They soon stopped using the token altogether, flattened the clay envelope, and by 3100 BC, they had graduated from mere figurative representation and were using symbols for numbers to indicate the amount of a certain object or image. Moving from accounting to actual writing occurred sometime between 3300 and 2500 BC. Near Mesopotamia, while Uruk was beginning its infancy as a city 3500 BC, in Egypt farming villages were becoming and or giving way to larger chiefdoms and local kings emerged. Around 3150 BC, King Narmer unifies Upper and Lower Egypt, beginning the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and at the time, with a population of around 10,000, was the city of Hierakonpolis. Egyptian cities didn't reach the sizes of their counterparts in Mesopotamia. Like in Mesopotamia, the Egyptian language seems to have been born out of accounting techniques, developing from mere pictorial representations to more abstract symbols, and their script was in use by 3100 BC. The next area to have had cities arise was the Indus River Valley. The earliest remains of this civilization are frighteningly foggy because, for one, the water table has risen and the remains are now underwater, and also because their script, of which we have the earliest inscriptions from about 3000 BC, is as yet undeciphered. But by 2500 BC, cities had already been established in the region. Perhaps by as early as 3200 BC, the first cities were forming in two areas. First in northern India at Harappa, and moving south at Mohenjo-daro. Homes varied significantly in size, the grid-style street layout speaks to intentional planning, and most homes had bathing facilities. In contrast to other agrarian civilizations, large palaces and temples don't seem to have existed, so they don't appear to have had kings either. Further setting it apart from other civilizations, the signs of warfare, swords, shields, helmets, and chariots, are missing as well, as are any depictions of war in their art. While this civilization will have come apart at the seams and dissipated by 1500 BC, perhaps this seemingly more peaceful approach is reflected in the later ideologies of India. With civilizations having arisen in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, two more areas for our first flurry of human civilizations come from China, though full-scale urbanization begins significantly later here. Along the Wong Ki River, during the time of the Longshan culture of about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, evidence of increased professional specialization appears, and by 2500 BC, some settlements had graduated to being walled. By about 1700 BC, or a little later, the Xia dynasty arose in the valley. During the Shang dynasty, which followed, starting about 1500 BC, the Wong Ki Civilization became a proper, full-scale agrarian civilization. Writing came to be, and working landless peasants were conscribed at times for battle and public projects, and there was a large slave class as well. While hereditary kings ruled and enforced their will, there doesn't appear to have been any state religion or large-scale irrigation. Meanwhile, in southern China, about the Yangtze River, there was a city by at least 1400 BC, and by the 3rd century BC, northern and southern China were united under the Qin and Han dynasties. Moving out of Afro-Eurasia, we move next to the Americas, where in Mesoamerica, by around 1200 BC, the Olmecs flourished in Mexico. The Olmecs don't represent a proper state-level civilization, but they built big things like ceremonial centers and 100-foot-tall pyramids, and from sometime within the wide range of 1400 to 400 BC, they left us humongous basalt heads. They warred as well, and may have had writing. By 400 BC, there were some half-dozen states on a plateau in the Mexico basin. Farther south, pyramids, temples, and irrigation systems that appear by at least 2000 BC showed the developing resource control in Andean culture, and soon after 300 BC, regional states emerged in the region. With agriculture planting itself firmly in the human story by 11,000 years ago, starting some 5,500 years later, 5,500 years ago, the first civilizations are getting going. These civilizations would rise and fall and have others take their place for the rest of history thus far, though about 300 years ago, we went through a revolution similar to the agricultural one in that it increased our available resources, and just as agriculture took humanity's capacity astronomically higher than it was in the Paleolithic, so too did the modern revolution when the time came.